at the Indiana University School of Optometry and a professor emeritus of public health at both the Bloomington School of Public Health for IU, as well as the, Indiana University Richard M. Fairbanks School of Public Health, which I believe is in Indianapolis. Prior to retiring from Indiana University 7 years ago, he was the Indiana University Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Multicultural Affairs, so a vice president for the whole university. And at a Big Ten institution, we know what that means. That's mostly hard work, but it also means that you've risen to a campus-wide distinction, and they must have needed your help. Before being named to that role, he was the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs and Student Administration at the IU School of Optometry. He has a long and distinguished CV. Most notably, he served, let's see how, let me find exactly, sorry. He's past president of the National Optometric Association, the Indiana Optometric Association, and the Indiana Public Health Association. He also served as a U.S. Public Health Service Primary Care Policy Fellow and as a member of the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine Committee on Public Health Approaches to Reduce Vision Impairment and Promote Eye Health, which I know he believes that contribution was a signature achievement for him. He's a diplomate in public health and environmental vision and fellow of the American Academy of Optometry. He's received multiple awards from both optometry and public health organizations. Most notably on the optometry side of the house, in 2006, he was the Indiana Optometrist of the Year and the National Optometrist of the Year in the past from both the National Optometric Association in 1976 and the American Optometric Association in 2007. Those dates alone let you know the time period that Dr. Marshall's career and excellence have spanned. In 2009, he was inducted into the National Optometry Hall of Fame. And in 2017, the Indiana Optometric Association honored him with a Lifetime Achievement Award. Indiana University has honored him with the President's Medal for Excellence, the School of Public Health Bloomington Founding Dean's Medallion for meritorious contributions to public health, and the Bicentennial Medal. And in 2019, he received a Distinguished Alumni Service Award from Indiana University. So we feel so lucky to have Dr. Marshall be able to spend the next time with us to talk with us about the passions in his life, diversity, public health, optometry. And if you have questions, Dr. Marshall will address them at the end. So please put them in Q&A because we have chat turned off, and I'll moderate those questions at the end. So without further ado, Dr. Ed Marshall.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Dean Zadnick and the Myers family for the invitation to be this year's Jeffrey and Joyce Myers Lecturer. It is a personal privilege. It's a personal privilege to be here, albeit virtually. And as always, it's a great honor to be acknowledged by one's peers. And for this, I am deeply, deeply appreciative and humbled. And congratulations to you, Carla, to being the Academy's 2020 Prentice Medal awardee. And I also commend you on your leadership in bringing forward last month the first of its kind virtual ASCO NOA Academy Joint Symposium on Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, which I understand was the single largest event ever put on by the American Academy of Optometry. And congrats to Professor Emeritus Greg Good on receiving the Henry Peters Award from the Academy's Public Health and Environmental Vision section. I also offer congratulations to the OSU College of Optometry on being the recipient of the 2020 Health Professions Higher Education Excellence and Diversity Award. I believe you are the only school at College of Optometry listed in the 2020 HEAT awardees. And I want to give a couple of special shout outs. First to Bob Newcomb, from whom I have very fond memories from 3 decades ago, when the two of us worked side by side, co-editing the second edition of Public Health and Community Optometry. And Dean Van Nasdale, who I had the pleasure of working with on the CDC Vision Health Initiative, and now as a fellow member of the Center for Vision and Population Health at Prevent Blindness. And a special thank you to Dean Emeritus Mel Shipp. Mel and I were both undergrad and optometry classmates in Indiana, and it was Mel who suggested that I consider optometry. Each of us is shaped, at least in part, by those around us who contribute wittingly or unwittingly to our growth, to our knowledge, and to our experiences as we mature as individuals and as health professionals. As a young optometry student, I was fortunate to be among the mentoring presence of such professional icons as Dr. Jack Bennett, Dr. Irv Borge, and former Buckeye turned Hoosier, the father of international optometry, Dr. Henry Hofstadter. Drs. Bennett, Borge, and Hofstadter, along with a supporting cast of others, instilled in me a sense of community, service, and commitment to my profession and the communities we serve. It was my relationships with those early mentors that created the springboard to what professional success I may have enjoyed over the past 5 decades. They inspired me to think beyond the exam room and the question of which is better, one or two, and to come to understand that better was not confined to the patient's choice of clear vision through selection of the forced option of lens 1 or lens 2. But that better also implies options outside of our immediate vision or personal reality. A year after graduating from the IU School of Optometry, I was recruited to establish the school's first off-campus clinic with a commitment to serve the vision and eye care needs of the community's underserved population. Then 4 years later, into my academic appointment, Dr. Hofstadter called me into his office and asked if I would be interested in teaching a new 6-week education course in India. Shortly after that, he allowed me to walk in his shadow as he introduced me to the International Optometric and Optical League, the precursor to the World Council of Optometry. An introduction that ultimately led to professional visits and consultancies to over 20 countries in Asia and the Pacific Rim, Central and South America, Europe, the Caribbean, and South Africa. Those experiences provided me with a strong foundation and led to treasured understandings where I learned to recognize the value of diversity and appreciate the differences in people and their cultures with a newfound humility as I worked with our optometric cousins around the globe. Seeing firsthand the opportunities, both locally and abroad, to help people better their conditions, whether they be personal or professional, coupled with several other foundational experiences in my young professional life, like helping shape legislation to expand access to healthcare services for low-income children in Indiana, producing the state's first data-driven plan to eliminate racial and ethnic health disparities, and collaborations with other health providers and legislators in examining factors that affect the health of minority populations. My sense of duty and professional obligation to promoting the public's health grew with appreciation of the broad scope of the word better as it applied to the acknowledgement and the personal realities of others. From those early experiences, my professional journey found its purpose, bridging the domains of optometry and public health, particularly around issues of access and quality. In those days, it was relatively uncommon to use optometry and public health in the same sentence. So I had to carve out a path that was somewhat non-traditional within the disciplines of academic optometry. There was no public health educators special interest group in ASCO, no public health and environmental vision section in the academy, and no vision care section of the American Public Health Association. At my first APHA meeting in the early 1970s, I was frequently asked, what was an optometrist doing at a public health meeting? That question caused me pause and provoked me to take a deep look into the unrealized connection between the tenets of optometry and the principles of public health. I sought out the wisdom of early optometric public health visionaries like Norm Hafner and Henry Peters, who helped give traction to public health as a sub-discipline within optometric education and practice. Thus began my journey outside the exam room, and into a career focused on population health, bringing novel questions of access, equity, and social justice to the optometric agenda. Now, as we reflect on the year 2020, the so-called year of vision, we cannot escape the fact that the social climate of our country is teetering at a seminal moment in our history, within the context of both health and social justice. So I would like to use the latitude of the Myers Lecture to bring a message about what I called the not so great American truths, the reality of social injustice and the colorization of health. The World Health Organization defines health as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. Social justice can be defined as justice in terms of the distribution of wealth, opportunities, and privileges within a society, making equity in health an ethical and moral concept based on the principles of distributive justice and the absence of socially unjust or unfair and avoidable health disparities. It therefore seems logical that social justice and health equity have to be at the center of driving a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being. Obvious to all of us is that health and well-being create the foundation for constructive human behavior, including educational, social, and economic achievement in childhood, adolescence, and adult life. Not so obvious is that health and well-being is a concept that exists not as a silo in a system of blood, flesh, nerves, and bones, but as a holistic construction in a higher order health mosaic, interwoven into the tapestry of the body politic. As far back as the 4th century BC, Hippocrates understood that illness has, in addition to its biomedical context, an environmental, social, and behavioral context, allowing us to think of health disparities as being mapped to a complex set of interacting factors such as access to care, doctor-patient communication, cultural beliefs, and trust. However, Barbara Reimer, Dean of the UNC Gillings School of Global Public Health, advises us that health is not only a function of genetics, individuals' behavior, good health care, or good luck. It also is influenced by context, history, policies, programs, environment, and opportunities. The data informs us that disparities in health, which present as differences between population groups in the way they access, experience, and receive healthcare, are not randomly distributed and do not occur by accident. Dean Reimer's comments urges us to consider the reality that health inequities and resulting disparities arise also from explicit and implicit public policies and institutional practices that unjustly perpetuate unfair and avoidable health inequities or fail to alleviate their impact. For example, zip code is a stronger predictor of poor health than genetic code. Driving this thought further, the effects of residential segregation from such practices as redlining often are complicated by what is referred to as allostatic load, or the body's physiologic changes in response to chronic, social, and environmental stresses communicated through day-to-day exposure to racial bias and discrimination. Allostatic load, therefore, factors into the social determinants of health at the cellular level and contributes as an upstream etiology to higher rates of chronic illness, such as high blood pressure, diabetes, and asthma among racial and ethnic minorities. The Center on Health Equity Action at Families USA states there is a fierce urgency of now for evidence-based policy solutions that either address the underlying systemic injustices or mitigate their impacts on poor health. The Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and the National Academy of Medicine are focused in partnership on building a culture of health, where everyone in America has a fair and just opportunity for health and well-being, regardless of their race, ethnicity, income, or zip code. But it is unreasonable to believe that a culture of health can survive against a culture of social injustice, where people of color continue to face gaping disparities in avoidable morbidity, health care access, and quality outcomes. A nationwide survey on race and health, conducted in August and September by ESPN's The Undefeated and the Kaiser Family Foundation, found that 70% of African Americans, compared to only 43% of Hispanics and 41% of whites, are more likely to perceive discrimination in the US healthcare system. While this is not a research lecture, I believe research is the foundation of all truths, as truth is the embodiment of fact or true reality. Yet we also hold certain truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal, and that they are endowed with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The truthful reality is that all men and women are not born equal, nor are they fully endowed with the right to life, liberty, and happiness. Nor was it intended to be so for Black and Indigenous people of color when Thomas Jefferson penned those words in 1776. Just 2 months ago, the National Academy of Sciences reported that Black newborns die at 3 times the rate of white newborns. But interestingly, racial concordance, that is, when Black newborns are cared for by Black physicians, survival improves significantly. While this may be surprising or even shocking to some of you, it is unfortunately one of the not so great American truths. The African American experience with social injustice and inequities in health started 400 years ago with the introduction of forced labor in the form of slavery to this native land. But the COVID-19 pandemic and its disproportionate and devastating health and economic impact on the lives of Black, Latinx, and Indigenous populations, approaching a 6-fold increase in mortality in some African American communities, further exposed the pervasive and present-day consequences of social and structural inequalities on perpetuating and expanding racial and ethnic disparities. Coronavirus, which is now the 3rd leading cause of death in the US after heart disease and cancer, pointed a penetrating spotlight on the many ills of a healthcare system that has much too often failed the vulnerable populations and people of color. Commenting on the difference in COVID-19 exposure and positivity rates for African Americans compared to white Americans, a Northwestern University cardiologist remarked, "These observations are rooted in the recalcitrant reality of the deeply entrenched history of healthcare disparities and may settle as the most painful example yet of the regressive tax of poor health." One of the essays from the Pulitzer Prize-winning New York Times Magazine 1619 project hypothesized that in the United States, racial disparities have proved as foundational as democracy itself. While race is not a biological construction, it nevertheless is too often identified in our race-conscious society as a marker for morbidity. But at the same time, we cannot allow race to legitimize the myth that a racially different biology is the punitive cause for health inequities within minoritized populations. Over a century ago, W.E. Du Bois wrote, "The Negro death rate and sickness are largely matters of condition and not due to racial traits and tendencies. With the improved sanitary condition, improved education, and better economic opportunities, the mortality of the race may and probably will steadily decrease until it becomes normal." Unfortunately, Secretary Heckler's 1985 report of the Secretary's Task Force on Black and Minority Health did not show the progress that Du Bois predicted, stating that Blacks, Hispanics, and Native Americans, and those of Asian Pacific Islander heritage have not benefited fully or equally from the fruits of science or from those systems responsible for translating and using health sciences technology. The report quantified the disproportionate burden of racialized health disparities among the nation's minority populations and officially placed the crisis of racial and ethnic disparities on the public agenda. 17 years after the publication of the Heckler Report, the Institute of Medicine released Unequal Treatment, Confronting Racial and Ethnic Disparities in Healthcare, as a compelling body of research with indisputable evidence of the persistent racial inequality in our nation's healthcare system. The IOM declared that across virtually every therapeutic intervention, ranging from high technology procedures to the most elementary forms of diagnostic and treatment interventions, racial and ethnic minorities receive fewer procedures and poor quality healthcare than whites, even when access-related factors, such as patients' insurance status and income, are controlled, and patients' preferences, behaviors, and attitudes are unlikely major sources of such disparities. The 2018 National Healthcare Quality and Disparities Report from the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality reported that between 2000 and 2017, healthcare quality improved across 54% of 147 quality measures, such as person-centered care, effective treatment, care coordination, and affordable care. However, Blacks, American Indians and Alaska Natives, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders receive worse quality of care than whites for about 40% of measures. Hispanics received worse care for about 35% of measures, and Asians received worse care for 27% of measures. The Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies, reporting on the economic burden of health inequalities in the United States, found a 30.6% excess in direct medical care expenditures for African Americans, Asians, and Hispanics attributable to health inequalities. Now, much of the emphasis has been on eliminating avoidable morbidity from such conditions as heart disease, stroke, cancer, and diabetes. Millions of Americans struggle with undiagnosed or untreated vision impairment and poor ocular health, affecting academic and social development, mental and physical health, independence and mobility, social engagement, employment and economic security, the ability to perform activities of daily living, and caring for family members. Basically, the health and quality of life of individuals, families, and society as a whole, and costing millions of dollars in unnecessary medical care and lost quality of life years. Yet, as a chronic condition, vision impairment remains notably absent for many population health agendas and community programs. But like other chronic conditions, vision impairment too often reflects the broad social, economic, cultural, and environmental disadvantages that contributes to disparities in healthcare and the healthcare outcomes that plague many of our culturally diverse communities. We know all too well that Black and Latinx people carry some of the greatest burden, often unknowingly, for ocular mobility and suffer the consequences of life-altering vision impairment. Because good ocular health is not always indexed to the ability to see clearly, with increased risk for sight-threatening conditions like glaucoma, diabetic eye disease, and hypertensive retinopathy, taking an unnecessary toll on the most at-risk populations. John Wittenborn and David Ryan at the National Opinion Research Center at the University of Chicago estimate that between 2020 and 2050, glaucoma will increase by 74% for African Americans and a whopping 202% for Hispanics, compared to 37% for whites. Similar increases are projected for cataract and diabetic retinopathy. The story is the same for all vision impairment and blindness, with triple-digit percent increases for African Americans and Hispanics, contributing heavily to an inflation-adjusted societal economic burden of $717 billion by 2050. These unnecessary and in some cases increasing disparities join to focus our failures in moving towards greater eye vision health equity. They pose moral and ethical dilemmas and bring into the profession's consciousness the necessity for an open and candid conversation about questions of the intersectionality of equity and social justice and the unbearable incongruity of a socially just and health disparate society. Dr. Alan Nelson, the former chair of the IOM Committee on Understanding and Eliminating Racial and Ethnic Disparities in Healthcare, noted that the real challenge lies not in debating whether disparities exist, because the evidence is overwhelming, but in developing and implementing strategies to reduce and eliminate them. Admittedly, the Affordable Care Act was designed, among other things, to advance health equity and reduce health disparities, including those in eye and vision health, by helping all Americans access quality and affordable health care. And this year's release of the revised 10 Essential Public Health Services places health equity at the core of its framework for protecting and promoting the public's health. Similarly, health equity is an overarching goal of Healthy People 2030. However, University of Michigan School of Public Health professor Sherman James reported that because racism, operating through varied interpersonal and institutional pathways, is a fundamental cause of racial ethnic disparities, the elimination of these disparities cannot be achieved without first undoing racism. I understand from an August 25th Health Affairs blog, the Ohio State University Wexner Medical Center and Health Sciences colleges declared racism, not race, a social determinant of health, and acknowledged that social determinants often equate to disparity, and are in many cases institutional expressions of racism, oppression, sexism, injustice, and inequity. Considering that inequities experienced by one generation may be felt across subsequent generations, Black and brown skin can represent socially determined pre-existing conditions for excessive multi-generational morbidity, as well as multi-generational wealth gaps. A September report from City Global reported that the Black-white gaps in wages, education, housing, and business investments attributable to racial inequities have levied a tangible tariff on the economy and society by costing the US $16 trillion over the past 20 years. And that closing the gaps today would add $5 trillion to the US GDP over the next 5 years. However, one of your colleagues in the Department of Sociology at Ohio State, along with several other researchers at other institutions, found that despite the consistently reported positive association between socioeconomic status and health, upward mobility may not guarantee Blacks and Hispanics protection from acute and chronic discrimination and unfair treatment. Colett and her colleagues concluded that for young African American and Hispanic Americans, gains in SES might result in more as opposed to less exposure to discrimination. And these encounters with unfair treatment, because of frequent and challenging psychosocial threats that trigger a cascade of responsive physiological changes, explain a sizable proportion of the Black-white gap in self-rated health among upwardly mobile young adults in the US. At the third National Leadership Summit on eliminating racial and ethnic disparities, the late Senator Edwin Kennedy challenged us to do all we can to close the health disparity gap and empower our communities to meet and master their health challenges in ways that acknowledge and celebrate our diverse American cultures. We have gathered and studied the epidemiological data. We have witnessed the persistent manifestations of inequity, and we have waited on the infrastructure and processes necessary to ensure that everyone has an equal opportunity to exercise their unalienable rights to life, liberty, and happiness. We now have to go beyond the data and be holistic, person-centered clinicians, taking a population health approach to understanding the issues and attacking the equity gaps by looking upstream at the primordial determinants of eye and vision health and their attendant ill effects on quality of life within our society, and particularly within our communities of color. For example, we know estimates of between 8 and 16 million people in the US with uncorrected refractive error, and we often reference its potential downstream effects on learning, employment, and independence, and frequently stratify these effects by race or ethnicity to demonstrate differences in rates of morbidity. But with this knowledge of epidemiology, and as we teach about the association between the social construct of race and ocular mobility are pondered individual strategies for our patients, how often in optometric education and training is health equity and the historical perspective of the social determinants of disparate health among vulnerable populations discussed and critically analyzed in the frame of cultural epidemiology and patient-centered care? How often do we go upstream and explore racial inequities or the root causes of the underlying social demographic characteristics and conditions that predetermine disparate eye and vision mobility? Do we ever consider and attempt to address how patient trust and patient-provider discordance and even discrimination and racial ethnic bias play on the risk for continued mobility and introduce significant consequences for overall health and support the perpetuation of an intergenerational health-wealth dynamic on eye and vision health disparities? Exploring the intersection of racial injustice on the epidemiology of eye and vision health may be considered somewhat of a novel concept for some in the academy, but not for the descendants of the physical, psychosocial, psychological, and social damage done by hundreds of years of discriminatory and abusive racialized practices. Like the infamous US Public Health Service sponsored Tuskegee study of untreated syphilis in the Negro male, or the historical endorsement of non-factual myths about the anatomy and physiology of African Americans compared to white Americans that were articulated to legitimize slavery and racist policies and support the false narratives about their biological inferiority, such as having smaller brains, thicker skin, less sensitive nerve endings, blacker blood, and interestingly enough, stronger sight with a seldom need for spectacles and a smaller field of vision that creates the ability to better bear the rays of the sun because of, and I quote directly from the May 1851 issue of the New Orleans Medical and Surgical Journal, an anatomical peculiarity in the inner canthus, contracting the field of vision and excluding the sun's rays, something like the membrane nictitans formed by a preternatural development of the plica lunaris, like that which is observed in apes, end quote. Medical schools and hospitals were thought of by African Americans as places of terror, violence, and shame, not of medical care. These historically ingrained mistruths continue to weigh on the conscious minds of many African Americans and reinforce deep-rooted distrust about the value and integrity of the US healthcare system. With an estimated 56% of African Americans expressing even today a distrust of the nation's healthcare system to do what is right for them all or most of the time. And conscious and unconscious biases based on mythical and fallacious assumptions present modern day cultural challenges to communication, trust, satisfaction, and ultimately the quality of the patient-doctor relationship, with potential adverse effects on the health disparity gap. Minority participation in research is necessary to understand and address population differences in disease prevalence and outcome. However, continuing mistrust and fear based on long-standing experience with exploitative, unethical, immoral, and in many cases, sadistic medical procedures and non-therapeutic experimentation creates present-day barriers and challenges to enrolling Black and Brown communities in clinical trials, such as modalities for the treatment of eye disease or COVID-19 vaccine trials. The Undefeated and Kaiser survey reported that only 50% of Blacks compared to 61% of Hispanics and 65% of whites said they would get a coronavirus vaccine, even if it was determined by scientists to be safe and was available free to everyone who wanted it. Harriet Washington's award-winning book, Medical Apartheid, The Dark History of Medical Experimentation on Black Americans from Colonial Times to the Present, peeled back the years of the historical onion and revealed that for African Americans, the full cost of lost health and lost trust are still being reckoned. It has been proffered by the chair of the Department of Family and Community Medicine there at OSU that by omitting dialogue around the real causes of poor health, health professionals' education has proliferated potentially life-threatening social categorization of Black patients through scientifically unfounded teaching, and that we cannot be content to teach future healthcare professionals about caring for the downstream consequences of racism without addressing its upstream roots. But one might ask, why should we in optometry be concerned with the social determinants of ill health, such as the socioeconomic causes of the high persistence of uncorrected refractive error in communities of color? The simple answer comes from the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. Taking the social conditions in which an individual lives, works, and plays into account is critical to improving both primary prevention and the treatment of acute and chronic illness, because social context influences the delivery and outcomes of healthcare, as well as individual health-related behaviors, such that improvements in overall health metrics are likely to depend, at least in part, on attention being paid to these social determinants. I can recall it not being too long ago at an American Academy of Optometry Public Health Symposium on obesity, when it was questioned as to why were we discussing obesity at an optometry meeting, not immediately appreciating that obesity is a near upstream or at least an intermediate cause of diabetes and diabetic eye disease. The same could be said for the association between smoking and the increased risk for AMD and cataract. Patients and health providers are more likely today and in the future than at any time in the past to bring to the clinical encounter a complex cross-cultural array of attitudes, customs, preferences, assumptions, expectations, practices, and fears that help decode experiences, form perspectives, influence decisions, and drive behavior. I think the evidence is clear that racial and ethnic concordance, along with training to facilitate cultural competence and humility, that is, being other-oriented rather than self-focused, improves opportunities for better understanding of healthcare needs and practices, and leads to better healthcare outcomes. Yet, at a time when university deans and presidents, C-suite executives, professional and college athletes, the entertainment world, and most media networks are confronting the truth of our social reality and leveraging the weight of their celebrity voices, images, and platforms to raise the nation's consciousness in unity against racism and injustice. A September 22nd executive order out of the White House claimed that diversity training promotes divisiveness with racial or sexual stereotyping and scapegoating. The order bars challenges to a one-dimensional worldview of our country's history by banning anti-racism training for government employees, contractors, and federal grantees. As a point of clarity, my comments today are not motivated by nor reflective of any attempt at diversity training, as I intentionally stayed outside the fringe of the executive order. While the order claims not to prevent promoting racial, cultural, or ethnic diversity or inclusiveness, it purports that many people are pushing a different vision of America. And this destructive ideology is grounded in misrepresentations of our country's history and threatens to affect core institutions of our country. Quite the contrary. The order failed to acknowledge and in fact denied the truthful reality that our country has already been infected, not by overdue diversity training, but by a long, shameful history of negative ideology against people of color. The Association of American Medical Colleges said it best. Both the country and the community of academic medicine have not always lived up to the ideal of equal opportunity. And our history includes painful examples of racism, sexism, prejudice, and conscious as well as unconscious biases based on race, gender, and other identities. This history and these biases have led to inequities in healthcare that are increasingly evident in our nation. Only through better understanding of our conscious and unconscious biases, learning about other cultures in our pluralistic society, reaffirming our commitment of being anti-racist, and challenging long-held beliefs that we hold ourselves and that we hold about others, will we heal the divisions now shaking our nation to its core. I should say that while I personally agree with some of the statements contained in the executive order, they must be assessed contextually in light of the EO's promotion of an alternate reality. Thinking back to the cautionary words of Edwin R. Murrow in 1954, we can deny our heritage and our history, but we cannot escape responsibility for the result. The American Public Health Association, along with cities and counties in 27 states, including 22 cities and counties in Ohio and the city of Columbus, have declared racism a public health crisis. While research has demonstrated the benefit of diversity education and training in reducing explicit and implicit or automatic biases and stereotypes, it also has demonstrated that the attitudes and behaviors of healthcare providers are among the many factors that contribute to racial ethnic disparities in health and healthcare. We all should understand that each of us represents a blend of cultures that are conditioned by the collective and diverse experiences associated with our age, race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, education, religion, socioeconomic status, geographic residence, and even our occupation or profession, and that we all have conscious and unconscious biases mediated through our composite cultures and lived experiences, and that not all biases are negative. As optometrists, we often exercise our unconscious biases to make quick and efficient shortcut type judgments about our patients and their clinical conditions or situations. Such across the room diagnoses may have purpose as a starting point in the clinical conversation, but they should not represent the endpoint of that conversation. As a personal reflection, and I have her approval to say this, my mother moved out of state following her retirement. And after her first medical checkup with a new physician in a different locale, she commented to me, "The physicians here don't do the same tests as my previous physician." I asked her if she inquired why, and she said no. Being a retired school teacher, my mother was not an uneducated woman and was accustomed to challenging unexplained actions, except when it came to her doctors. I suggested that on her next visit, she asked the doctor why he didn't conduct the test that she was accustomed to having performed. A few months later, after her second visit to the new physician, I asked if she had queried the doctor about the test he didn't conduct. She said that she did. What was his response, I asked. He said he only did what Medicare allowed, obviously relying on his implicit assumption that my mother was totally dependent on the advice of Medicare for her health care. And how did you respond to that? I continued. I told him I have money. Well, my immediate thought was that she probably should not have said that. But the short of the story is, the doctor conducted a more extended battery of tests, including a colonoscopy, which revealed several precancerous polyps that he was able to address in a timely manner, but only because my mother challenged the doctor's stereotypic assumptions, which he used to govern his actions, in the absence of a more informed discussion with his patient and the opportunity for her to be fully engaged in decisions about her health care. My mother's story is but a small example of what transpires too often in racially or culturally discordant patient-provider interactions. When implicit bias enters the patient-doctor encounter, the nature and balance of the conversation is frequently altered, and the context and the contextual knowledge of the patient is often compromised and underutilized. From my mother's anecdotal example and the supporting research, we get the idea that stereotype-based decisions can influence our perceptions and behavior and negatively impact patient-centered care, thereby affecting timely decisions, treatment adherence, and health outcomes. Implicit bias training and tools like the implicit association test may unveil previous unaware dissociations between conscious and unconscious attitudes. And as Greenwald and Krieger note, implicit biases are especially problematic because they can produce behavior that diverges from a person's avowed or endorsed beliefs or principles. As a nation increases its diversity, we value its many contributions, offering different perspectives on different issues and contributing to the cultural constitution of our society. But our different beliefs, values, attitudes, and experiences can introduce a non-traditional dimension into the traditional biomedical paradigm of clinical care and create obstacles in the form of contested variations in health understanding, behavior, and practice, and challenge opportunities for positive interaction and communication between patients and providers, producing intercultural and interpersonal climates of needless confusion, mistrust, and misunderstanding that too often abet a widening of the health disparity gap for populations of color. Today's reality is that in a society of many riches, we find that healthcare services, treatment outcomes, and health status, while improved for much of the population, have not improved equally or proportionally for all racial and ethnic groups. As we think about the WHO definition of health, the health profession of optometry has a defined role to be visibly at the vanguard of addressing the complex circumstances that impede the attainment of full health and well-being for all society. The question that should be at the forefront of our profession's healthcare policy is, why should anyone, because of where they live, the color of their skin, where they come from, the language they speak, how much money they make, or the culture of their community, be exposed to a greater risk of lifelong suffering from diabetic eye disease, losing their sight from glaucoma, or being functionally handicapped and isolated from their family and community because of preventable but untreated vision impairment. As we address this and other challenges that front the shores of our cultural horizons, let us seek to forever embrace the richness of our diversity and the colorful threads that weave the fabric that cloaks our lives and conditions our understandings, perspectives, and behavior with a new-founded unity of purpose for the benefit of mutual awareness and respect. Harvard psychologist Howard Gardner, in his 5 Minds of the Future, informs us that the mind of the educated citizen of the future will be a respectful mind, one that goes beyond mere tolerance and welcomes individual differences while celebrating diversity as a fact of life, with a need to understand the perspectives of others, finding common cause to convey and earn trust, and to not assume what was once believed on the basis of scattered impressions to be necessarily true. Gardner tells us that the minds of the future also will be represented by the ethical mind, one that serves purposes beyond self-interest and works selfishly to improve life for everyone. Others may talk about an empathetic mind, one that allows us to put ourselves in someone else's shoes. When we do so, we will get to look beyond our individual views and see through an ethno-wide lens a vision of a different social and cultural reality. But the path to an enlightened reality is not predestined. And the dance of social consciousness is often arrhythmic, as many of us have been silent for too long about our personally lived reality in the struggle to achieve both within and outside the profession. And those of us in the minority too often hear from the majority variations on the response, "I didn't know." My reality is not everyone's reality, nor is it the reality of every African American. For like all populations of people, we are not monolithic. While we do share many commonalities, we have our unique stories of challenge and survival as we face our personal realities. I was born into what's referred to as a Jim Crow South, with segregated everything: water fountains, buses, trains, diners, neighborhoods, and schools. I was not able to attend kindergarten because there was no kindergarten for Black kids during that era of my youth. And I attended the first grade in a dilapidated room that serviced 3 or 4 different grades of Black kids at the same time with a very overworked teacher. We had to take special care not to further damage the tattered and marked up materials that had been passed down from the white schools. As a young child, my uncle would take my cousin and me on Sunday afternoon car rides, and we would always end up for a stop at the Dairy Queen. Being a few years older than my female cousin, I was the one to go inside and place our ice cream orders. Excuse me, not go inside, go and place our ice cream orders at the colored window outside the building, while my uncle and cousin waited inside the car. Entering the building was for whites only. My skin tone was a little lighter than it is today, and on one occasion, as I walked up to the colored window to place our order, the lady on the other side of the window looked at me and said, "Child, why are you at this window? Come inside." Not being bashful and seizing the unusual opportunity and with complete knowledge of my actions, I went inside and placed our milkshake and chocolate sundae orders. As I gazed at my uncle through the window of the Dairy Queen, I thought he was going to have a heart attack inside the car. When I returned with the ice cream treats, the car's engine was racing as my uncle hurried to pull out of the parking lot before our true identities were discovered and the police were called on me for violating the law. As part of the Great Migration of African Americans out of the South, my family moved from Albany, Georgia to New Jersey in hope of better opportunities. During the summers, I often returned to Georgia to visit relatives. And on one of those occasions, I got to meet and march with Dr. Martin Luther King, who met at my uncle's house when he came to Southwest Georgia as part of the Albany movement in the early 1960s. For that experience, I got to dodge rocks and beer bottles that were thrown at us as we walked arm in arm out of Mount Zion Baptist Church following a mass meeting with Dr. King, while the local police stood by and watched and waited for an opportunity to fill their jails with peaceful marches. My elementary and high school years in New Jersey, in contrast to my Georgia experience, were with classmates from a variety of ancestral identities. However, even with an A- average and playing several sports in a high school that was ranked at the time 33rd in the country scholastically, I was discouraged by my guidance counselors from going to Indiana University on the reasoning that no one from our high school had previously attended IU, and that maybe I should consider a less competitive college or university. I found out much later, at least 3 graduates I'm aware of had preceded me at IU and had gone on to become very successful Hoosier alumni. Undaunted, I boarded the train and headed to the unknown frontier of Indiana, reflecting a conscious East Coast bias that everything between the Allegheny and Rocky Mountains was outside of my metropolitan imagination. When I arrived on the IU campus as a freshman in 1964, I came with an understanding that there would be challenges of academic rigor, challenges of reaching the high standards that I had set for myself, challenges of meeting new friends and supporters of my academic dream. Not among my list of challenges were the challenges of a racially unfriendly subculture, the challenges of isolation, the challenges of confronting up close and personal, the exposed as well as the hooded naysayers of that time. During my first week in Bloomington, 2 of my Black friends and I inadvertently came upon a cross burning while exploring the countryside not too far from campus, and when discovered, were chased with guns aimed at our rear. Luckily, my community of Black Greek brothers and sisters, and in all fairness, even some of my Jewish Greek brothers and sisters of the day, provide a lifeline to identity, confidence, and success, and a needed link to civility and the opportunity for personal growth in an otherwise undernourished social and communal environment. But even as recently as a couple of years ago, as a professor of optometry and as a vice president of a major university, I was stopped by a county sheriff a few miles from my house as I was traveling to a meeting of the Indiana Optometric Association to be asked whose BMW was I driving and where was I going. Relating this personal experience to Colin's research on discrimination and upward mobility, wearing a suit and a tie did not excuse me from the potentially scary and dangerous situation. Truth surfaced through a variety of personal revelations. Recently, I was asked, did I have any idea of how my life would have turned out if my family had not moved to New Jersey? Being preconditioned to the societal ills of that Southern Jim Crow zip code, I could only think it would have been at a high risk of being a lot different. So why did I tell you this, my story? Like any book, The cover of my book only gives you a superficial hint of what's inside, thus providing fertile ground for mistaken assumptions and misunderstandings about who I am. You honor me today for what you know of my life, that is my truth. But the foundation of who I am lies deep in the chapters and pages along the twists and turns of the cultural narrative that shapes the reality of my truth. My story, my reality, my truth provides an additional platform upon which to reckon the truth you perceive with the reality of my lived experience. It was instilled into me early in life that if I could touch the lives of others in positive ways, as I travel through this world, my life would have meaning and purpose. Central to our life's purpose is a special obligation to be good citizens, to embrace and promote the principles of equity and social justice and fairness for the welfare of all. What we might envision as an ethos of a modern society, founded in excellence through diversity, equity, and inclusion. As members of the Academy, we serve as central innovators, collaborators, catalysts, and advocates for educating our respective audiences on these uncompromised principles, which must be articulated and integrated into the core of all we do, with a vision and focus for action within a framework of policy and practice equity. We have many issues before us that continuously challenge our moral, ethical, and professional mission to transform disparity into parity. But we cannot allow today's challenges to quiet our resolve, nor can we allow ourselves the misguided luxury of accepting an unacceptable reality. We must venture beyond the historical boundaries of our personal references to embrace today's truth that it is not acceptable for anyone to be treated unfairly and unjustly, and to be without access to appropriate, timely, quality health care. Shortly after taking office, President Barack Obama talked about the importance of the Golden Rule and the call to love one another, to understand one another, to treat with dignity and respect those with whom we share a brief moment on this earth. He said it is an ancient rule, a simple rule, but also one of the most challenging. For it asks each of us to take some responsibility for the well-being of people we may not know or worship with or agree with, or even on every issue. It requires us not only to believe, but to do, to give something of ourselves for the benefit of others and the betterment of our world. Each of us is like a little sparrow that was found one day lying on his back with his little legs and feet arched towards the sky. When asked why he was lying with his feet pointing upwards, the little sparrow remarked, "The sky is falling, the sky is falling." The confused passerby then commented, "The sky is so large and your legs are so small. What can you do to keep the sky from falling?" The little sparrow replied, "I do what I can, I do what I can." So as we look for solutions to the proverbial falling sky of decreased access to healthcare and poor healthcare outcomes, we must be like the little sparrow in our own way, do what we can. Every one of us needs to have a higher estimate of our own significance, of our own sustained dedication to the civic life as part of a normal way of daily living. Building on that inspirational message from Ralph Nader, delivered during his TED-Med 2020 talk on what it takes to create social change against all odds, we each have a duty to each other, a duty to help nurture and support our uniqueness, while at the same time embracing our commonalities as facets in the mosaic that reflects our humanity and our values for civic engagement within the cultural fellowship we all seek. Irrespective of the final outcome of yesterday's election, I am hopeful that as a nation, we will move from the binary vision of which is better, red or blue, to a colorful spectrum of social and health equity and respect for the unalienable rights of everyone. It is common today to talk about being at an inflection point in our history. But if we are ever to overcome the dark penumbra that hangs over our country's history and change today's reality, we have to acknowledge and understand the truths that make it so, and reconcile the complexities of those truths with positive action. In a September 25th post in Diverse Issues in Higher Education, Dr. Renee White, provost of Wheaton College, stated, "Each of us must name, feel, and hear the truth of each other's experiences. We need to grapple with the ambiguity of truth and validate the lenses through which we see the world in order to see each other in all of our humanity." While science is a light that can lead us forward, we have to remember one of the most basic of all aphorisms of human behavior, in that we can heal with our humanity things we cannot cure without science. Realizing that equity is both a means and end, it has been said that we will know we have reached racial equity when race no longer predicts life's outcomes. Unfortunately, Dr. Martin Luther King's declaration of over 50 years ago continues to be relevant today, in that we have come a long way, but we still have a long, long way to go. But let us continue to peel away the disease of inhumanity and seek the diversity of thought, the equity of opportunity, and the inclusion of expression so needed and so deserved for the benefit of us all. As I come to the end of my talk, I request each of you to look into the mirror and face your own valued truths and think deeply about what you will do personally to make a difference. If anyone has been made uncomfortable by my words today, it is not me who made you uncomfortable, but the realities of the American truth. Realizing that 65% of Black men and 59% of Black women, regardless of age, income, and education, feel that it is a bad time to be Black in America. In an on-court interview after winning the 2020 US Open Tennis Championship, 23-year-old Naomi Osaka was asked, acknowledging her Black Lives Matter activism throughout the tournament, "What was the message you wanted to send?" She responded, "Well, what was the message that you got is more the question. The point is to make people start talking," said the #1 ranked tennis player. As future generations look back on this seminal moment in time, I hope that our continued and difficult but courageous conversations will translate into a cultural humility that breeds bold and committed actions for change, so that the next generations will find comfort in a zero gap between their current reality and the possibility of a new American truth viewed through a lens of racial equity and inclusion and parity of health and well-being across all human domains. For the sake of transparency, one could argue that everything I've said today is biased by the lens of my reality, and that I accept. As I said earlier, my reality is not the same as everyone else's. The challenge is to acknowledge our respective truths and to reconcile them in the social setting of equity and inclusion. Thank you again for the opportunity to share a few words with you this afternoon and the honor of being the 2020 Myers Lecturer. A close friend once advised, the real satisfaction is not in the honors or recognition received from peers, but in the thought that you have done your share to improve life and society. I will close with a quote from former Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall. "I wish I could say that racism and prejudice were only distant memories. We must dissent from the indifference. We must dissent from the apathy. We must dissent from the fear, the hatred, and the mistrust. We must dissent because America can do better, because America has no choice but to do better." It has truly been an honor and a pleasure. Thank you.
Ed, thank you so much. I feel like you are the antidote someone prescribed for me this evening. I think we have time for one question, and that question comes from Professor Cynthia Hurd, who is a proud Buckeye alumna and a professor at the Southern College of Optometry. So first she says, "I remember that story about your mother. I miss those stories." And then she asks, "Do you think it will take truth and reconciliation by the majority culture to occur before African Americans and other minorities will be treated as majority individuals in the doctor's exam room?"
Thank you, Cynthia. Very good question. Yes, I think we all have to look inwardly. Now, not only the majority, but also the minority, because we have to reconcile our differences which means those of the minority as well as the majority, against what we think to be the common truth, the reality of what we want to see in a racially equitable society. I think going forward, unless we are able to have an honest and reflective introspection with ourselves first, it's going to be very, very difficult to have conversations with others and reconcile those differences with others. I think many of us may deny what is unconsciously harbored within us based upon our lived experiences. We have to bring those to the surface. We have to reveal those, address them, reconcile them, and then begin to have conversations with the others. But yes, I think we have to have the majority involved in this collective conversation. They have to be truthfully engaged, committed, and understand that it's not going to be easy. It's not an easy conversation to have because we have too much history that's preceded this conversation. But we have to dissect it, understand it before we can go forward.
Well, with that, Ed, I will thank you. Jeff and Joyce Myers, who I know are watching, thank you so much for your generous support that allows for an evening like this. And Ed, I wrote down a quote that you had about what constitutes the mind of the future. And the words I wrote down were an empathetic mind and a respectful mind. And I thank you for bringing those characteristics to your remarks this evening. I truly can't thank you enough for this. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you for the honor.
And everyone, thanks for attending. The talk is recorded. If it will be available, if people, say, oh my gosh, I meant to go to that and I didn't get to. So please wait for that and we'll have that. And I thank you all for attending. We've got great talk, grateful for your personal stories. My phone has texts on it as well. So thanks so much, Ed.
Also for,
oh yeah, show us your
lovely, for this lovely acknowledgement of the lecture. I really appreciate it.
You're very, very welcome. Thanks, everybody. Have a good evening. Don't stay up too late watching returns. Bye.